There's been no shortage of news coming from Brevard Public Schools this year. From teacher raise negotiations, to hiring security after the Parkland shooting, to the superintendent's resignation, education is a crucial topic in Brevard. I'm Isadora and this is Eye on Brevard. This week, I talked to Vanessa Skipper, Vice President of the local teachers union, the Brevard Federation of Teachers. We talked about Superintendent Desmond Blackburn's legacy, raising taxes to pay for raises and school security, and the new discipline policy in Brevard schools. Watch. Vanessa, thank you for being here with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invite.
So, a lot is going on with Brevard Public Schools, so we're going to try to cover everything here with the very little time that we have. And let's start with the most recent news, which is Superintendent Desmond Blackburn has announced that he will be resigning before August, which means the district will now start looking for a new superintendent. But and before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about his legacy. I mean, he came to Brevard in 2015 from Broward, and seems to have done quite a bit for the district. What are the things that jump to your mind when you think about his legacy, and good or bad or neutral?
Well, with Dr. Blackburn, we really appreciate, as far as the union and his having an open door to speak with us. That was not the case with the last superintendent, and while the union may not have always agreed with Dr. Blackburn, and maybe we didn't always see eye to eye, there was the ability to have a conversation, and I think with anyone in leadership, that's very important.
And so some of the things he's done, he scaled back teacher evaluations and district mandated testing. He moved to in-house legal counsel, developed a new discipline policy, and he pushed for a non-discrimination policy for LGBTQ students and staff. What do you think is his defining legacy here?
I think probably one of the biggest things he did was making the uniform discipline policy. We have yet to really see how that's going to impact our schools. I believe that kind of ties into some of the funding that we might talk about a little bit later, because when you are dealing with student discipline, there always has to be that mental, emotional, social support that goes along with that, and I really don't believe we have that in the county yet, but I'm hoping that we're working towards that.
Yeah, so let's explain a little bit what this new policy is. The concern in the past was that minority students, at-risk students, disabled students were being disciplined more than other students. And so now you have a uniform policy, which means, you know, this punishment applies to these kinds of infractions. Does that make, how does it impact the work of teachers in the classroom? And I imagine it's supposed to make it easier for you guys, but is that what teachers are really seeing?
It's supposed to make it easier. I don't think that's what teachers are seeing right now. I think there's a lot of pressure on schools, but when you look at the discipline policy, really administrators are given still a lot of freedom with how they discipline students. And again, when a student commits an infraction that causes them to be removed from the classroom, we're not confident that everything's being done to help that student or rehabilitate that student before the student's reintroduced into the classroom. A lot of times it's, you know, a day in ISS or a day in OSS and then they're back. We need to be better about helping these students with their social emotional so that they can be successful inside the classroom and outside the classroom.
And when you say you're not confident that they're being helped, is that what you're talking about, lack of funding or any other issues?
I think that's a little bit of both. It's lack of funding, because everything is driven by the dollar. And you know, Florida's ranked 41st in the nation for per pupil spending. So really, when that money comes down to the districts to decide how they're going to allocate it, I think one area that has been cut or falls short is social emotional character building in our schools. And it's not that I think the district doesn't want to do it or the schools don't want to do it, it's just the time, the money, the place, the pressure of standardized testing, making sure every student has seat time and they're taking tests and you know, they're trying to meet all the requirements the state has put on us, when most of those requirements are unfunded.
And we talk so much about mental health, but I always wonder, what does that mean and what does it look like for teachers? What are the stuff that teachers are dealing with in the classroom when it comes to mental health issues, to discipline issues? You don't need to cite specific students, but what kind of behavior issues are we talking about here?
Well, students sometimes, especially in some of our lower socioeconomic areas, students come to school with all sorts of chips on their shoulders, with life experiences that are a lot of times out of their control. And so when you come to school and you're frustrated, or you haven't eaten, or there was no power on in your home, or perhaps your parents are always working 2-3 jobs just to make the ends meet, you already come to school frustrated. So you can tell some students that just have the weight of the world on their shoulders. So perhaps they might act out because of those frustrations. And like I try to tell all new teachers or teachers coming in, to never take a child's behavior personally, because it's probably not directed towards you. It's probably rooted in something else. And when students are coming in and you've got 25 students in a mesh class, math, English, science, history, our elective teachers sometimes see upwards of 45 to 50 kids in one class. That's a lot of social emotional needs to be able to capture. And it's not like we can't just write them a pass to go see their school counselor, because instead of being school counselors, our school counselors are now standardized testers and schedulers, and basically check boxes off of a sheet rather than simply being someone there that students can talk to. And that's certainly not our counselor's fault. That's just mandates that are put onto us. A lot of kids will act out because they feel like they're seen as a number. They feel like every time they walk into a classroom, they're seen as their standardized test score. And if they're behind, they usually will get frustrated and act out.
And the legislature passed a bill right after the Parkland shooting. And among the many things that it does is it provides more funding for mental health. Are you feeling a little better than now that there is more funding, or do you think that there's still a lot more to be done?
I think there's a lot more to be done. I feel a little bit better that they put funding into mental health counseling. I'm a little upset that they used money that they were going to use to fund education already and just split it into this separate bill, this separate pot of money, which let the other pot of money kind of fall flat at 47 cents FEFP. But the problem is, and I'm not sure quite on the mental health funding, but I don't think those dollars are reoccurring. So I am unsure moving forward that if we put extra counselors in our schools, if we spend money on extra character education, if that money is going to be available the next school year, if that's something they're just going to pull. So, I would really like the priorities of the legislature to fully fund mental and social emotional health counseling, education, year after year for students.
And then when you mentioned the other pot of money that they have diverted funding to, that's for school resource officers, school security, and the controversial Marshall program, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But let's go back to the search for a new superintendent. The board decided not to hire a national search firm, which could cost around $40,000, and they're going to look for a new superintendent in-house. You guys support that decision, right?
Absolutely.
Explain why, and who are the top candidates in your mind?
As far as why, I mean, you look at why are we spending $35,000 to $40,000 to go outside when we have talented candidates right here in the county? I think the one thing that we lack in this county is the idea of using the leadership that we have and using the leadership that we've grown. As far as the candidates for superintendent, I'm not sure who has all thrown their name in the race, but I do know that Dr. Mark Mullins submitted his name the last time, so I'm assuming he probably would be submitting his name again, and I think he'd be a great choice. She'll probably kill me for saying this, but Dr. Stephanie Sullivan used to be the principal of Cocoa High School. She was my principal. I'd love to see her be superintendent. I don't know right now, but someday I think that she would be spectacular in that role as well. And again, I'm not quite sure who else might be interviewing for that.
So it's more of like continuing the work that Dr. Blackburn has done versus a complete shift in direction. And I think that's one of the messages that the board was trying to convey, that we want to stay on the same track and not a dramatic shift, which was the reason why they hired Blackburn, was to do that sort of 180, right?
Right.
And so another big issue, like that we have been covering is the school board's decision to hire security specialists. Up until last week, they were considering arming volunteer school employees, which the union opposed. But you believe that security specialists are a compromise, right?
I think it is a compromise. You know, obviously our contract did not allow for them to arm school teachers, so their other options would have been custodians, cafeteria workers, administration, and we could go into why all of that's a bad idea, you know, especially since admin really interact with students on a daily basis. So if there were any kind of issues, a fight, they wouldn't be able to break that up. I think the security officers were a compromise to that. It's definitely not ultimately what we would like to see. I think what we would like to see is a law enforcement officer in every school. And I think that we sell our police officers short by assuming that somebody that we can pay cheaper is going to be able to do a better job than they can. We look at law enforcement, firefighters, teachers, we're public servants, and a lot of times public servants are not funded appropriately. We see the funding falling flat for not only education, but for our firefighters, for our law enforcement, and it's no surprise that these are the options. And I think any parent would say that, you know, a school resource officer, Brevard County Sheriff's officers, or any of the city police that we have would make them feel safer. I know it makes me feel safer if I had a deputy at my son's school over a school safety specialist.
Yeah, so these security specialists will get the same amount of training that marshals would have gotten, which is 176 hours of training through the sheriff's office. A lot of parents have said, you're just putting lipstick on a pig. You know, you're giving the same training, it's just a person who, instead of being an existing employee, is a new employee, and then we'll pay actually over $1 million to hire these people. Your thoughts about that? Do you share those concerns, or why are those two actually different?
Absolutely share those concerns, and a couple of the board members said, oh, you know, they're going to get the same amount of training that a deputy would going into schools, and I fail to see how that's actually the truth, because these school resource officers not only are in our schools, but they still perform duties as a law enforcement officer in our community. So during the summer, when school's not in session, they're on the street. They are, you know, patrolling the community. They are receiving more training. So when I really stopped and thought about, you know, the deputies and the city police officers, some of them have been in schools for 10 years, 12 years. But every summer or on the weekends, they're doing extra duty, they're getting extra training. There's no way in my mind that an officer has the same amount of training or capabilities or has the same as a school security specialist. I had the opportunity to do a ride-along with a deputy, and just in that 12 hours, I experienced so much more than I think a school safety officer would experience with that little amount of training.
And what has been on teachers' minds since Parkland? I know that's probably an all-encompassing question, but how has it changed in the classroom dynamics, or just, you know, how teachers look at their jobs now?
I think teachers, and I can speak from my own personal experience, the one thing that I did this year that I never thought that I'd ever have to do, or never really thought about it, is I taught my sophomores to hide. And instead of teaching English, we hid. And I spent an entire day with all of my classes. I have juniors and sophomores. And we talked about what would happen if this happened during first period or second period or third period. And I took it as a chance to have a conversation with my students about awareness, being aware of what was around them. And I told them that, you know, even if their other teachers didn't have the same conversation with them, that no matter where they were on campus, to look at their surroundings and to think of a plan, what they would do. The day after and the weeks following after were very somber, and I think that it's changed the way students and teachers look at school safety. And I think that our students should have a voice in everything that we do as far as school safety, because they're the ones who traverse our campuses every day.
And since Parkland, or at least Florida Today has covered several stories of students bringing guns to schools, making threats. We saw a student at Ocean Breeze Elementary who had a kill list. Are those things getting more common? I think it is the public perception that it is, or is it just that now we're paying more attention to kids acting out?
I think we're paying more attention to kids acting out, and I think we should pay more attention to kids acting out, because before these things might have not gotten press, or maybe they were swept under the rug, and really we didn't do anything for those students who needed the help. Because clearly some of those are cries for help. They're cries for attention, they're cries for somebody pay attention to me, whether it's giving me positive attention or negative attention.
And let's move on to teacher raises.
Right.
In February, the union and the district agreed on new raises. I believe highly effective teachers will get a 1.8% raise. That was after very long negotiations with the district. Are you going to request another raise for the coming year?
Absolutely. And at some point, as a district, we've got to stop playing the blame game. A lot of times when we get to the table, they'll say, well, the legislature didn't fund us, the funding fell flat, which I will agree with all of those things. However, our school board has been very complimentary of our legislators from this district, and I don't believe that you can be complimentary of legislators while also at the same time telling teachers there's not enough money to give them a raise.
And the district has been talking about a nearly $4 million budget deficit for this year. I mean, is that something you're taking into consideration when you ask for raises, and do you empathize with what the district is going through in terms of funding?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we're going to take into consideration. Do we empathize? No. And again, that goes back to the idea that they have supported our legislators. And there's a difference between being friendly and working together and sitting down and having conversations, and also saying, hey guys, this is not enough. It's not enough. And I think in a state where teacher salary averages 45th out of the nation, we have a problem. And we're actually projected, if we keep on the same path with funding, projected to, in the state of Florida, drop to 50th in the amount that we pay our teachers. And we can't attract teachers to the profession, and we can't keep teachers in the profession if we're not even giving raises that keep up with inflation and or obviously increase their salaries.
And would you support a ballot referendum in November to raise the millage rate to pay for teacher raises, SROs, more school security?
Absolutely, 100%. I don't think a lot of people realize this, because I'll talk to people, they're like, oh, well, the Space Coast housing is increasing, home sales are up, people are moving to Florida in droves, they're moving to the Space Coast in droves. Why can't you get the funding? Or wasn't the Florida Lottery supposed to fund education? And the Florida Lottery doesn't fund K through 12 education at all. And also, what they do, the legislature cuts our millage at a certain point. So we're not able to realize all that extra money that comes in from
increased
housing.
Property
Right.
values, and that's something the legislature has done in the last couple of years. And not to play the blame game here with the legislature, but let's talk about some of the things that have come down the pipes from Tallahassee. We talked about funding, but the other major issue is charter schools.
Yes.
The Speaker of the House is very supportive of charter schools.
His wife owns one, so.
Yes, and last year he allocated $200 million for charter schools to move in next to struggling public schools. This year there is a scholarship program for kids in public schools who are bullied to move to a private school. Your thoughts about that shift in the legislature, and how do you see the future of public schools in Brevard and in Florida?
There's no question that public education is under attack. And anybody that wants to see public education fail, you start where the funding is. And you start by dismantling brick by brick the amount of money that you send to your traditional public schools. The Florida Constitution calls for a fully funded public education system. I don't believe that they're doing that. When you send money to charter schools, especially when there are several legislators in Tallahassee whose wives or family members own a charter school and stand to profit from taxpayer money being diverted, it's a disservice to the children of Florida. The other thing that's a problem is these charter schools are not held to the same standards as the public schools. You can't compare apples to oranges and then say one's failing when you didn't make the other do the same thing. We see all around the state, charter schools are always in trouble, or they're failing, or they're closing. And the problem that happens is all these taxpayers, they've sent money, those buildings close, and the charter schools can take everything in them, the computers, the materials, the supplies, everything. And I just think it's an inappropriate use of public funds. As far as the bullying tax credit, I believe that that was a program named so that people would not feel like they could go against it, because who doesn't want to help a child that's bullied? But that's putting a Band-Aid on a problem, instead of providing those schools with the resources they need to provide character education and mental and emotional growth, and really putting into place programs where there's peer mentoring and peer counseling. They are just going to take the money and send it elsewhere. That doesn't solve a bullying problem, that just sends it somewhere else.
And back to charter schools, a lot of people talk about school choice and parents being able to send their children to a school that they choose to. Do you understand that concept, and do you empathize with parents who want the ability to make more choices when it comes to the schooling of their children?
I absolutely do. I grew up a military child, and my parents sent me to private schools until the 9th grade, when my dad retired and I entered the public school system here in Brevard County. My parents chose to send me to private school. They also chose to pay for it. I remember my mom working as a secretary at the school to help with the tuition. As far as school choice, we already have school choice in the county. As long as you apply to the schools, you can choose to send your child to a school that is not in your neighborhood. My oldest son, received the McKay Scholarship, which meant I could choose to send him somewhere else, or I could keep him in the traditional public schools. I felt like the traditional public schools was meeting his needs, or were meeting his needs, so I kept him there. The idea that we don't have school choice is just an idea perpetrated by those who stand to make a profit by sending more money to charter schools. We've had the choice with the McKay Scholarship, I believe, for over 20 years now, maybe even longer than that. So if a parent with a student with disability or special needs needed to have their student go to another school because their public school was not meeting the needs, they could choose to do that.
And going back to another point that you made about the district and the school board, sort of standing up to our lawmakers from the Brevard delegation, what do you mean exactly by that? What kind of attitude you hope they would have when session starts, and in terms of really pushing for local priorities?
I think as far as local, everybody from our delegation talks about less government, right? More local control. But yet Tallahassee has done nothing for the past 10 years but take away local control. And they can't have the argument that they've funded the schools appropriately or they've funded the district appropriately, because several of the legislators, including Representative Fine, says they have the money, they just need to redo their priorities. And there's always fat to trim in any budget. There is, but I believe that our district is doing a good job at that. I'm sure that there's more fat that can be trimmed, but you can't look at U.S. Census data that says Florida's 41st in per pupil spending and 50 in per capita spending and say that you funded schools appropriately. You just can't do that.
And another action by the legislature this year was a bill that decertifies unions if membership falls under 50%. The argument is if a union cannot get support from a majority of its members, then it shouldn't exist in the first place. I assume that that our local union here opposes this, but how does this affect you in reality if it doesn't, in fact, have an impact locally?
We're over 50% here in Brevard. We still obviously oppose this legislation for several reasons. One, we're a right-to-work state, and in the Constitution, it gives us the right to collectively bargain. So this law inherently is unconstitutional. In addition, it assumes that a teacher who is not a member of the union doesn't believe in having a collective bargaining agreement, doesn't believe in having a contract, an agreement between the district and the employee. Every single year, we all get our contracts sent to us to re-sign for the next year. I don't believe anybody in the district doesn't sign their contract, because if they didn't sign their contract, they wouldn't have a job. So I think that legislation is unconstitutional, and we'll see a challenge very soon with that.
And we have only a minute and 20 seconds left, but I want to pick your brain about our this shortage of substitute teachers. What exactly is the problem in your opinion, and what can we do to alleviate it?
I think the problem stems from two things. Low pay, we don't pay our substitutes enough, and secondly, discipline in schools. Obviously, when the teacher leaves the classroom, a substitute comes in, a lot of times the kids are going to try more. Yeah. But sometimes, the schools, I think, where we see a lower percentage of substitutes subbing there, we really need to see what happens when a student misbehaves for a substitute. What is done about that? How is the substitute supported with that misbehavior?
All right, Vanessa, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
That's our show for today. My thanks to Vanessa Skipper for joining me in the studio. And if you have questions regarding today's episode, please email me at irangale@floridatoday.com. And be sure to join us again next week, right here on WEFS and on floridatoday.com.